In my view, monasticism was one of the most important institutions of Byzantine civilization, whether viewed from a spiritual, theological, intellectual, social, or economic perspective. Over the centuries, countless men and women found refuge, spiritual inspiration, and solace in monasteries, and many of them in turn served as counselors and confessors to pilgrims and the local lay community. Monks were among the most ardent defenders of icon veneration when it was threatened in the 8th and 9th centuries, and the hesychastic movement of the 14th century had its origins among the monks of Mount Athos. Monks and a few nuns were the primary authors of saints' lives, hymns, theological treatises, liturgical works, and homilies. Through their work as scribes, they preserved many classical and Byzantine texts, even secular ones, for posterity. Monasteries also fulfilled a vital social role by providing a haven for orphans, unmarriageable daughters, widows, and widowers, by running charitable institutions such as hospitals and old age homes, by providing shelter and food for travelers and offering food and alms at their gates to the poor. Finally, monasteries were a major engine in the Byzantine economy, especially as substantial landowners and producers of wine and foodstuffs, such as grain, olives, and tree fruits, but also through their ownership of commercial properties. As this audience is well aware, the predominant form of Byzantine monasticism was the Coenobitic monastery, such as the Great Lavra on Mount Athos, which you see before you. The Coenobitic monastery took its name from the Greek words for the common or common life, koinos bios or kinos vios. Here lived a community of monks or nuns who had taken lifetime vows under the direction of a superior to whom they owed absolute obedience. Ideally, it was a community whose members ate the same food at the same table, wore the same monastic habit, attended the same liturgical services, and performed duties to serve the common good. In reality, of course, there were hierarchies and inequalities. Although Coenobitic monks and nuns made up by far the majority of Byzantine monastics, significant numbers chose a different form of spiritual commitment as recluses, hermits, stylites, and wandering monks. This evening, I should like to explore with you some of these varieties of monastic experience in Byzantium. After a brief introduction to the Coenobitic monastery, I shall examine some of the other paths followed by Byzantine monastics, with a focus on the great fluidity and flexibility of their lifestyles. I will conclude with some reflections on the ongoing debate throughout the Byzantine centuries about which form of monasticism was superior, the Coenobitic or eremitic, and the hybrid lifestyles which evolved as a kind of compromise. My emphasis will be on the later Byzantine period from the 9th to the 15th centuries. From the time of their initial establishment in 4th century Egypt, Coenobitic monasteries emphasized celibacy, obedience to the superior or abbot, communal participation in the liturgy and daily monastic offices, communal meals in the refectory, manual labor, and usually, but not always, a renunciation of material possessions. Sleeping arrangements varied, but the individual or shared cell was more typical of Byzantine monasticism than large common dormitories. Unlike the West, where various monastic orders came to be established, such as Benedictine, Cluniac, Cistercian, Franciscan, and Dominican, there were no orders in the East. Each monastery had its own individual rule, in the beginning probably handed down from one generation of monks to the next as oral tradition. But from the 9th century on, the regulations were codified in written documents, often called tipika. And here you see a title page from the Dumbarton Oaks publication in 5 volumes of the surviving monastic tipika. Tipika might share some common elements on dietary restrictions, for example, or bathing privileges, but the 60 surviving monastic foundation documents all differ substantially from one another in both form and substance. The common elements were often drawn from the typikon drawn up for the Constantinopolitan monastery of Studios, reformed by Theodore of Studios in the early 9th century. Thus, one can see a number of parallels between the Studite typikon and the rules established for the great lavra on Mount Athos by Athanasius in the later part of the 10th century. A century later, the typikon of the Evergetes monastery, located just outside the walls of Constantinople, proved enormously influential on a number of subsequent foundations. But each typikon was unique, reflecting the location of the monastery, the circumstances of its foundation, and the personal views of the founder or κτήτορ. Cenobitic monasteries also varied greatly depending on whether they were rural or urban, or situated on a holy mountain, such as Athos or Olympos in Bithynia. They differed in the size of their endowments, in the number of monks, and the degree to which they operated as major property owners. Smaller monasteries had to be focused entirely on providing for their material necessities, while larger, wealthier establishments could support intellectual and artistic activities in libraries, scriptoria, and workshops for the production of icons or wood carvings. Nunneries had virtually identical physical layouts as male establishments, and their rules were similar, but there were some significant differences. It seems that fewer women than men took monastic vows, and the number of convents was lower than that of male monasteries. Nunneries were more likely to be located in cities than in the countryside for the security of their inhabitants, and were either prohibited or strictly limited on holy mountains. Nuns seem to have been more rigorously cloistered, with very specific regulations for receiving visitors or leaving the convent to see their families. Women religious also adhered more closely than male monks to the ideals of cenobitism, with regard, for example, to the principle of monastic stability, that is, remaining for life in the same monastery where they had taken vows. The 12th century canonist Theodore Balsamon applauded this difference between the sexes, praising nuns and unfavorably comparing Byzantine monks with their brethren in the medieval West, who dined together and slept in a communal dormitory. In his view, and I quote, "Only in Byzantine female monasteries are a common dietary regimen and sleeping arrangements observed," end quote. He argued that the cenobitic lifestyle was both necessary and appropriate for nuns, since women who had left their fathers' homes needed the mutual protection of communal living and should not live on their own. It was more difficult for convents than male monasteries to observe the principle of avaton, that members of the opposite sex were forbidden entrance to the monastic enclosure, as at Marsaba near Jerusalem on Mount Athos and the Metamorphosis Monastery at Matera. Some men had to be admitted to nunneries to serve as priests, spiritual confessors, physicians, and occasionally as stewards. But wherever possible, these men had to be eunuchs or elderly and married. The literary production of Byzantine nuns is disappointing in comparison with their male counterparts in Byzantium and their female sisters in the medieval West. A few letters, hymns, and saints' lives are all that survive. But female monastics, both choir and household sisters, were literate and could read scripture and saints' lives. Some young nuns were taught their letters within the convent precincts. Choir sisters learned to chant psalms and sing hymns, and sometimes gained quite a reputation for their musical skills. I would argue that one of the most important contributions of convents to Byzantine society was the social services they provided to the poor and infirm who came to their gates for charitable assistance. The poor received alms and handouts of bread, wine, and leftovers from the refectory, and some of the infirm and elderly might be fed and receive long-term nursing care in a nunnery's hospice. Convents also benefited society through their role as a haven for women in distress, especially widows. They were true shelters for women who took the monastic habit at a late stage of life. They were assured during the remaining years of food, lodging, medical care, burial, and commemorative prayers within the secure precincts of the cloister walls. The Coenobitic monastery is the most familiar form of monasticism to students of Byzantium, but it presents only part of the overall picture of Eastern medieval monastic life. Over the years, I've become increasingly fascinated by the variations in monastic lifestyles, on the way in which many Byzantines who desired to leave behind the material world and devote themselves to God found alternative routes to their goal and often embraced several different forms of monastic life sequentially during their careers. I should emphasize, however, that non-Coenobitic types of monasticism were typically espoused by men rather than women, who, as we have seen, tended to remain in their convents. The most common alternative to taking vows in a Coenobitic monastery was to live in the wilderness as a hermit, following in the footsteps of Saints Antony and Paul of Egypt. For monks who wished to pursue an even purer and more austere withdrawal from earthly distractions, there was the option of retirement to the desert or the wilderness, either as a dependent of a lavra, an institution which combined elements of communal life and eremitism, or as an independent, unaffiliated hermit. Particularly popular for hermits were the holy mountains, isolated locales, ideal for the pursuit of spiritual tranquility. The source material for information on the eremitic life is found mostly in saints' lives, reflecting the fact that a significant number of Byzantine monastic holy men who received canonization lived as hermits for part or much of their career. The freedom of solitaries from the highly regulated regimen of a Coenobitic monastery and the oversight of an abbot, who might try to restrain extreme asceticism, meant that hermits could engage in more severe mortification to the flesh and were more likely to be recognized as holy men. My research has shown that access to food was the determining factor in the degree of solitude achieved by a hermit. A solitary connected with a lavra, such as Marsaba, would spend weekdays in his own isolated hut or cave, engaging in prayer and other spiritual exercises, and performing some form of manual labor. On weekends, he was expected to go to the lavra to attend the liturgy, take a meal in the refectory, and obtain supplies of food and work materials for the coming week. He could remain in total solitude 5 days a week, but engaged with his community on Saturday and Sunday. Independent hermits had to make other arrangements for their provisions. Often they had a young disciple who secured their food supplies by fetching bread and legumes by hiking to a nearby monastery, or else might catch fish and forage for wild plants. Or a local layperson, such as a shepherd or peasant, might bring food supplies and water to a hermit who did not wish to leave his cave. And here you see a hermit way up above, raising up his supplies in a little basket. A few of the most zealous ascetics vowed to be totally self-sufficient. They subsisted by foraging for nuts, wild plants, and berries, and had access to a nearby water source. Seclusion in the silence and isolation of the wilderness or desert, and the lack of distraction by fellow human beings provided optimal circumstances for total focus on prayer and contemplation. The reduction of possessions to an absolute bare minimum, subsistence on a frugal diet, performance of ascetic exercises such as an all-night standing vigils, and endurance of bitter cold and blazing heat were all aspects of self-mortification designed to lead to complete disregard of one's physical body, thus better enabling concentration on spiritual exercises and, for the select few, attainment of a mystical, ecstatic union with God. The term used for this spiritual contemplation and tranquility the primary focus of the solitary monk was ησυχία, meaning literally quietude. The life of the solitary was obviously much more physically and spiritually demanding than that of a cenobitic monk. Common wisdom held that a young monk should first spend a few years in communal life in a monastery, learning to chant the monastic office and accepting the principle of obedience to a superior and a monastic typikon before setting off on his own in the wilderness. Athanasius of Athos permitted young monks to withdraw to an individual kelion, or cell, only when they had gained self-discipline and been initiated into a rigorous regimen of meditation and prayer, so as to better withstand the physical and psychological perils of a solitary life. In the 14th century, when the youthful Maximus the Hut-burner arrived at the Great Lavra on Athos, he asked the resident monks which path he should follow first, that of the hermit or the cenobite. The elders strongly recommended that he remain in the monastery for a while to learn humility and submission to an abbot before progressing to a contemplative life in the wilderness. It was essential for the would-be solitary ascetic to be trained in abnegation of the will, which is viewed as taking priority over self-mortification. The sequence described in some of these vitae of a young monk first being trained in a cenobitic monastery and then moving on to the rigors of a life of solitude reflects the belief that the eremitic life was more difficult and by no means attainable for all monks. Only the most self-directed and focused youths would receive the abbot's permission to leave the communal routine for the wilderness. The implication is that eremitic life is of a higher order than cenobitism, and it is no coincidence that so many monastic saints spent at least part of their careers as solitaries. Yet, not all hagiographic sources agree on the superiority of the eremitic life, and a number of authors stress the negative aspects of espousing eremitism, such as the dangers of despondency or akidia, a common affliction for solitaries. Although subsistence on foraged wild plants was generally praised by hagiographers as a sign of a holy man's capacity for self-abnegation, there are occasional hints of a more critical attitude in the hagiographical literature. For example, in the life of Niphon of Athos, a 14th century hermit, some of his fellow monks and the superior of the Great Lavra criticized him for living in the open air on plants alone. The abbot reminded Niphon that excessive asceticism could lead to conceit and that moderation was preferable. He told Niphon that there was no need for him to emulate the so-called grazers of the Judean desert from early Christian times. The abbot argued that the desert fathers ate plants because there was no bread in the desert. But, and I quote, "Here on Athos, there is both bread and other food to eat, so to avoid conceit, you should be content with these," end quote. Besides the dangers of despondency and self-conceit, another acknowledged disadvantage of the anachoretic lifestyle was lack of access to regular church services and reception of the Eucharist, and the scarcity of religious texts. At most, a hermit might possess a psalter, or perhaps a gospel book, New Testament lectionary, or liturgical book of hymns, but usually he was limited to recitation of the psalms and hymns that he had committed to memory. We can catch only occasional glimpses of the spiritual devotions of hermits through brief allusions in their vitae. Thus, we know that they routinely chanted morning prayers, engaged in occasional all-night standing vigils, made numerous genuflections, sang hymns to Christ and the Virgin, recounted spiritually beneficial tales to each other, and recited psalms as they walked the steep paths of holy mountains, including the appropriate verses from Psalm 120, "I lifted up mine eyes unto the hills." Niphon of Athos used to recite the entire Psalter while standing on one foot. Maximus the Hut-burner, who dug his own grave near his cell so that he could meditate on the inevitability of death, and I quote, used to repeat by heart the mournful funeral hymns, end quote, during his morning prayers, while standing next to his future grave. Lazarus of Mount Gelasium is described as singing the office as he made his initial ascent of the holy mountain, and as reciting the entire Psalter as he made a second ascent to take up residence in a cave. In the early days of monasticism on Athos, the holy mountain was inhabited only by hermits with no Cenobitic monasteries, and hence no regular church services. Some Athonite hermits, such as Blasius of Amorion, had already been ordained as priests or deacons and could celebrate the liturgy privately. Others, such as Euthemius the Younger, sought ordination specifically so they could celebrate the liturgy. Yet others would go on weekends to monasteries outside the peninsula to attend services. But many were forced to forego participation in any formal liturgical rituals. In the 10th century, when Athanasius of Athos established the Great Lavra, as you've heard, he made provision for 5 hermits who were formally associated with the monastery. They were to come to the Lavra on Sundays to partake of the Eucharist. Over the centuries, hermits devised a number of solutions to the problem of lack of access to the Eucharist. Those who remained continuously in their hermitages took advantage of traveling priests like Nephon of Athos, who in the 14th century made the rounds of outlying monastic cells on the Holy Mountain for 3 years, reciting the regular daily office and celebrating the Holy Sacrament. Nephon also found a ruined church and got permission from the bishop of Hierosos to restore it and celebrate the liturgy there for anachoretic monks. In 10th century Anatolia, Paul of Latros, living high up on a rocky pillar, had a ladder constructed so that a priest could climb up and administer the sacrament to him. In central Greece in the 10th century, Luke of Styros was so concerned about a hermit's access to the Eucharist that he consulted with the bishop of Corinth. The latter advised him to obtain a vessel with pre-sanctified bread and place it on an altar in a chapel or on a clean bench in a monastic cell. Then the hermit should spread out a small veil, place the holy bread on it, and burn incense. Finally, he should sing the Psalms of the Typica office or the Trisaion hymn and recite the Creed, kneel 3 times, and put the bread in his mouth, saying Amen. He could drink ordinary wine instead of Eucharistic wine. The problem with this advice was that the bishop assumed that the hermit had access to a source of pre-sanctified bread, a liturgical veil, and incense, which were not among the usual possessions of a solitary. Let me now turn briefly from hermits to some other alternative monastic lifestyles. Most were more closely related to eremitism than cenobitism, but I will begin with a late variant of Cenobitic monasticism, the Ideorhythmic monastery. This was a development of the late Byzantine and post-Byzantine centuries and is best known in the monasteries of Athos, which maintained this lifestyle well into the late 20th century. It is usually viewed negatively as a rejection of the ideals of the common life, since it permitted monks to cook and eat in their individual cells, to rarely attend the liturgy, to earn private income through the manufacture of handcrafts, and to have personal possessions. It represented an extreme form of the tendency toward individualism that we will see in other monastic lifestyles, which I will now discuss. The recluse, or enklistos in Greek, meaning literally one who is enclosed, was found both in monasteries and in the wilderness. Unlike his counterpart in the medieval West, who enclosed him or herself in a confined space such as a cell or tower, whose door was permanently blocked with stones or bricks, the Byzantine recluse voluntarily confined himself in a cave or cell for a limited period of time and could leave any time he wished. Those who wanted to practice an extreme form of mortification could place themselves in a tomb-like hole where they would meditate on their forthcoming death. The recluse could be either a cenobitic monk or a hermit. In either case, he was dependent on a colleague or servant to bring him food and water and remove his bodily excretions. The recluse carried to an extreme the vow of monastic stability, yet his period of enclosure was often relatively short, a period of months or a few years, after which he might move to another location or to another monastic lifestyle. The most famous Byzantine recluse was the Cypriot Neophytus the Enklistos, who secluded himself in a cave-like space hollowed out of a cliff near Paphos. The cave included a rock-cut sleeping bench, a desk, an altar, and his tomb. Later on, after a small monastery developed in the vicinity of his cave, in order to escape crowds of pilgrims who flocked to the site to venerate him, Neophytus carved out a smaller cave higher up on the rock face called the upper enclosure. And I think those two windows you see up high are the windows into the upper enclosure. His ascent to this upper cave has been likened to that of a stylite or pillar saint who moved to a taller column. As he advanced toward spiritual perfection and ascended toward heaven, Neophytus's second enclosure overlooked the interior of the monastic church so that he could observe the performance of the liturgy. Stylites, or pillar saints, who are particularly associated in the beginning with Syria, were found throughout the empire, in Constantinople and Thessaloniki, and on holy mountains such as Galicion near Ephesus. Residence atop a pillar symbolized the physical removal of the ascetic's body from earthly distractions and his spiritual ascent toward heaven. But only a select few monks were sufficiently disciplined to embrace the lifestyle of a stylite, and they were thus viewed as among the elite of holy men, akin to angels. Stylites took up residence atop a column that was preserved from antiquity or built anew, or sometimes on a pillar-like column of natural rock. Usually they dwelt inside a small roof shelter placed on the column capital and had access to the outside world through a window or door. A ladder placed against the column permitted the ascent of visitors or disciples bearing food and water. In contrast to recluses, stylites usually remained on their columns for very long periods of time, as much as half a century, although sometimes they might move to a taller or more remote column to gain distance from crowds of pilgrims. They thus were the most ardent observers of the principle of monastic stability. Some stylites, such as Lazarus of Mount Galicion, managed to direct monasteries from atop their columns. And I should note that the stylite was a peculiarly Byzantine phenomenon and was virtually unknown in the medieval West. While recluses and stylites exemplified extreme fixity of abode, a third alternative form of monasticism rejected any stability at all. In late antiquity, both canon and civil law supported the principle of monastic stability. That is, that monks or nuns were admonished to remain for life in the monastery where they had taken vows, unless they received the express permission of their bishop to leave. But from late antiquity on, throughout the Byzantine centuries, we encountered the phenomenon of monks wandering from one monastery or holy mountain to another, remaining for a few years in each location before moving on in a restless search for the ideal coenobion or hermitage. These wandering monks also spent time on pilgrimage, often to shrines as far distant as the Holy Land, or sought out renowned practitioners of monastic life in both monasteries and the wilderness. Wandering monks, often referred to pejoratively as kiklefter or yirefter, that is, those who go in circles, were of necessity mendicants, forced to beg for bread and lodging as they passed through villages or on street corners in major cities. Obedient to neither a monastic nor an ecclesiastical superior, These monks were valued by the populace for their spiritual counsel, charismatic behavior, and prophetic utterances, while being criticized by monastic leaders and ecclesiastical authorities for their independence, their failure to perform manual labor, and their material dependency on others. Among the famed wandering monks of Byzantium who became holy men was Lazarus of Galicion. Lazarus spent about 25 years on the move before finally settling down on a pillar on Mount Galicion, with stops of varying duration at monasteries in Anatolia and the Holy Land, including the Lavra of Marsaba near Jerusalem. He made pilgrimage to the shrines of St. Michael at Choneh and St. John at Ephesus, the Loca Sancta of Palestine, and lived for a while as a hermit in a cave near modern Antalya. His many years of wandering culminated in 40 years of fixed residence atop 3 successive pillars on Galicion. A holy man of the 14th century, Sabas the Younger, spent 20 years in perpetual travel after being forced by Catalan raids to leave Athos for Cyprus. In addition to being a wandering monk, he also played the holy fool during his journey, and moreover maintained a vow of silence, which made it more difficult for him to beg for food or explain himself. He went almost naked, except for a loincloth, and spent long periods in solitude in caves in the Holy Land. He visited Mount Sinai, and at length returned to Athos after a circuitous return journey to Crete, Athens, Euboea, and Constantinople. It is remarkable that he had started his monastic career in a Coenobitic monastery on Athos and returned to communal life on that holy mountain after his years of wandering, thus epitomizing the fluidity of some monastic careers. Yet another alternative mode of monastic existence is a shadowy one, the little noted and understood phenomenon of unaffiliated monks and nuns who lived independently in both village and urban contexts. My research on them has raised more questions rather than providing answers. But the evidence comes mostly from reliable sources, such as the Archives of Athos or the Acts of the Synod of Constantinople. A number of these acts mention by name nuns who are not affiliated with any monastery and seem to be still living at home or in private lodgings and involving themselves with family financial matters such as property and inheritance disputes. The women are mostly widows who have apparently taken monastic vows but do not live under the authority of an abbess. Other acts allude to monks living in private lodgings and running small businesses. One such case of an unaffiliated nun is described in some detail in late 11th century documents from the Eviron Monastery on Athos. They tell the story of a wealthy young widow, Kali Pakuriani, who has become the nun Maria after her husband's death, but is still living in her home in Constantinople, along with her mother, sister, 2 female friends, and 2 freed women. All these women are described as being nuns. From Kali Maria's will and list of bequests, we learn that the women in her household who had taken monastic vows wore habits, and that her aristocratic mansion had a chapel equipped with icons, liturgical vessels, and books. She also mentions bequests to monks who may have served as priests and spiritual confessors for the women. The household is somewhat reminiscent of the house monastery organized many centuries earlier in Cappadocia by Saint Macrina, the sister of Gregory of Nyssa. There were also independent monks like St. Basil the Younger, who after years as a wandering monk took up residence in a series of private households in the imperial capital, where he offered spiritual counsel to members of the lay community, and seems to have had little or no association with monasteries or the ecclesiastical hierarchy, or even to have attended church services on a regular basis. As I conclude this section on alternative monastic lifestyles, I should once again emphasize that for the most part, They are characteristic of monks, not nuns. Probably because of the perceived need for nuns to live together in a community for reasons of security and propriety, they are only occasionally attested as hermits, recluses, and stylites, and almost never as wandering long distances or moving from one monastery to another. As a result, nuns were praised as staunch upholders of the Cenobitic ideal. In the final section of my lecture, I should like to expand on my arguments about the tension that always existed in Byzantium between the ideals of Cenobitism, life in a communal monastery, and eremitism, life as a solitary. There was also much discussion of the relative values of the two principal modes of monasticism and arguments as to which was superior. The Cenobitic monastery was often a self-sufficient, self-contained, and productive economic unit which provided for the physical needs of its monks. It furnished social and charitable services to the poor and needy, including care for the elderly and widowed, medical treatment, and distribution of food. Cenobitic monks often served as spiritual advisors and confessors for members of the lay community. One of their most important duties was the performance of prayers for the faithful, both while alive and after their deaths, to help ensure the salvation of their souls. The solitary, on the other hand, was often himself dependent on charity and the kindness of others for the essentials of food and even water, and engaged in little, if any, social interaction. He was focused on his own communion with the divine, not with prayer for the salvation of others. As we have seen above, however, monastic life in Byzantium should not be reduced to a binary opposition between the cenobium and the hermitage. It assumed a variety of forms which can be placed on a broad spectrum of practice, with regimens ranging from strict adherence to a common rule and obedience to a superior in a Cenobitic monastery to the total isolation of the hermit in a cave who foraged for his food. Some Cenobitic monks practiced extreme abstinence from food, while others were satirized for their obsession with lavish meals. Within a monastery could be found recluses who never left their cells, while in the idiorhythmic monasteries of later Byzantium, monks did not eat in a common refectory, but prepared their own meals in the privacy of their cells. As for hermits, some lived in small groups and worshipped at a nearby chapel, while others might go to a monastery on weekends to attend the liturgy and enjoy a communal meal. Some monks were stylites who never left their pillars, while others spent years traveling on pilgrimage to visit monasteries, holy men, and holy sites. Nuns, on the other hand, were most likely to live in Cenobitic nunneries, to remain cloistered, and to observe the ideal of monastic stability. There was considerable flexibility and fluidity in monastic careers, and the same monk could follow several different regimens over the course of his life. Stability was not highly valued except in the case of stylites and recluses, and even they sometimes moved around. These different modes of monastic life had only a few features in common: the taking of vows, renunciation of the secular world, celibacy, and a life of prayer and recitation of the Psalter. Asceticism could be practiced in a monastery, but was more typical of the hermit. Even the monastic habit was worn primarily by residents of monasteries, while hermits were most likely to be garbed in tattered garments made of goat hair or animal skins. Those Byzantine monks who abandoned Cenobitic monasteries for the wilderness were in part expressing their desire for individualism and their rejection of a strictly regimented communal lifestyle. They also believed that a personal search for contact with the divine, facilitated by isolation, asceticism, and constant prayer, was superior to the communal offices and liturgy of the Cenobitic monastery. Many of these hermits were noteworthy for their independence and autonomy. In theory, they had to seek permission from their abbot to leave the monastery, but once outside the cloister, they were subject to very little authority, answerable neither to abbot or bishop. This autonomy can also be seen in the little understood phenomenon of unaffiliated monks and nuns who lived in private homes or individual cells in urban environments and villages. Alexander Kazhdan has cogently argued that this individualism can also be found inside a Cenobitic monastery, where, for example, recluses could follow an eremitic regimen within the cloister. And according to the 12th century canonist Balsamon, many monks failed to follow the rule of communal meals in a refectory and sleeping in a dormitory. Kazhdan also remarks upon, and I quote, the apparent prevalence of eremitic and semi-familial ways of life, which allowed individuals to dispense with the set discipline within the monastery. He further asserts that, and I quote, to this degree of individualism in the style of life within the monastic community corresponded the individualism of monastic communities themselves, end quote, as we can see in the great variety of regulations in the Tipika and the absence of monastic orders in Byzantium. Throughout the Byzantine centuries, there was debate on the relative merits of Cenobitism and eremitism. As might be expected, most monastic rules urged strict adherence to Cenobitism. Thus, the 10th century rule for the Bulgarian monastery of Rila argued that Cenobitism was preferable as a practical matter, as a way possible for all. And I quote, the communal life is in every way more useful for monks than the solitary one, for solitude is not suitable for the many, but only for a few who are perfect in all monastic virtues. The common life, on the other hand, is useful in general for everybody. In the 13th century, Maximus, the founder of the Borini monastery in western Anatolia, praised the Cenobitic life as definitely superior to the solitary. The superior ought to direct all the monks practicing asceticism in the monastery to live together in the Cenobitic manner. A common outlook, a common way of thinking, and love of the brothers should be fostered among them. There is no doubt that living by oneself cuts one off from the others. By so being cut off, one is preoccupied with oneself and left to one's own devices, idiorhythmi in Greek. And this is totally incompatible with common life. One thinks about and is concerned about one's own good rather than that of another. Peace and union of minds are put aside and destroyed. On the other hand, having things in common binds together and leads to peace, and, as mentioned earlier, is the cause of a complete unity of attitudes and minds. In 1407, the Patriarch Matthew I, in his Typikon for the monastery of Harsianides, recognized that there were alternative forms of monasticism, such as the angelic life of the solitary or the laureatic combination of solitary and Cenobitic life. In his words, for there are many paths of piety for athletes, since our Heavenly Father also has many mansions, or rather, since there are many paths, therefore there are many mansions. But Matthew then argued that the coenobion was superior because of the establishment of a community of souls united by free will, with the abbot as Christ and the monks as disciples. It is a commonplace of many hagiographical texts that life in a coenobion is an essential stage of monastic formation, in which the novice learns discipline, obedience to his superior, and abnegation of his will, and is hardened by manual labor. Only after years of training is the young monk deemed ready to attempt the rigors of solitary life, if he so wishes. This was a tradition that goes back to the early centuries of Eastern monasticism, as can be seen, for example, in the words of Cyril of Scythopolis, who quotes Sabas the Great as saying, and I quote, that as the flower comes before the fruit, so the coenobion comes before the anachoretic life. Many centuries later, the lives of Maximus the Hut-burner emphasize the same point. When the young Maximus first arrived at the great Lavra in Athos in the early 14th century, He read the lives of both Peter, the first Athonite hermit, and Athanasius, a solitary converted to Cenobitism and the founder of the Great Lavra. In an agony of indecision as to which model of monasticism he should choose, he consulted the elders of the Lavra, who advised him that before becoming a hermit, he must first learn in a coenobion submission, humility, and obedience as divine tools that would quench the fiery darts of the devil. In contrast to the Tipika, which not surprisingly almost uniformly favors Cenobitism, hagiography presents a range of attitudes on the question of which mode of monastic life is superior. It gives a positive view of Cenobitism in the life of a great monastic founder or superior like Theodore of Studius, and praises the solitary life in the lives of holy hermits. After Euthemius, the future patriarch of Constantinople, 907 to 912, became superior of a monastery in the capital, he became discontented and considered withdrawing to a holy mountain. He was discouraged from this move, however, by the superior of the Studios monastery, who reassured him that if he continued his pattern of extraordinarily compassionate behavior, even though he remained in a coenobion in Constantinople, he would be blessed by the Holy Fathers, for his gift of compassion surpassed retreat to the mountain or the far desert. Euthemius's anonymous hagiographer clearly believed that charity in an urban environment outweighed asceticism in the wilderness. The lives of holy hermits present them as surmounting terrible physical hardships, essentially totally disregarding their bodily needs, and achieving a spiritual focus that sometimes enables them to attain divine enlightenment and union with God. They also acquire miraculous powers, such as clairvoyance and prophecy, the ability to heal, to bilocate, to levitate, and even to fly. At the same time, even their hagiographers may reveal a critical attitude toward their heroes and some concerns about their withdrawal from society. In the 9th century, Ioannikios of Bithynia, for example, came to passionately desire a totally solitary life, for during his 13-year residence in a cave, he was besieged by pious visitors. So he withdrew to an even more remote region because, and I quote, he could not endure being disturbed by interaction with humans, but wished to live immaterially and purely and without distraction and to converse by himself with God alone, end quote. After a while, however, he had a vision in which an angel instructed him to return to his original hermitage, and I quote, so as not to conceal himself, since God had arranged this for the salvation and benefit of many, end quote. These concerns expressed by Middle Byzantine hagiographers that hermits' withdrawal from society prevented them from providing charity and spiritual counsel are also found in later centuries. One of the most memorable passages in the 14th century life of Maximus the Hutburner by Theophanes is Maximus's encounter with the famous Hesychast monk Gregory of Sinai, who rebuked Maximus for his total avoidance of human interaction. He then urged him to settle down in one place so that he could associate with his fellow man, share his spiritual wisdom and insights, and teach them by example. Gregory reminded Maximus of Jesus' words, "Let your light shine before men and not before rocks." The debate on the merits of the two main models of monastic life was to continue until the final centuries of Byzantium, as both Cenobitism and eremitism continued to thrive. Some monks tried to resolve the issue by adopting a hybrid form of monasticism and becoming Keliots associated with monasteries, where they would go on weekends for liturgical services and a communal meal. Other monks resolved their dilemma by engaging in different types of monasticism at sequential stages of their careers. In the memorable words of the biographer of Sabas the Younger, who was at various times a wandering monk, a holy fool, a hermit, a cenobite, and a recluse, since there are many dwellings in the kingdom of heaven, thus the road of piety which leads thereto must branch into many pathways. It is appropriate for one man to walk one of the paths, for another man, another, for a third man, several of them, and for a fourth man, all of them, if he is able to do so. Thank you.